Chapter 8, Easy Come. After a welcome rest in the accommodations of wizards, the group roused the next day and made north, still processing the story told to them by the McGregors. They possessed one of the orbs. Certainly it was one of these wards, token it from its resting place. What ripples would this cause? Had they inadvertently started something they could not foresee? Traveling onward in the harsh midday sun, the adventurers reached a barren stretch of road, rocky and sparse of vegetation. Ahead, the path narrowed sharply into a natural bottleneck, flanked by steep cliffs. Leaning casually against one rock stood a red-skinned hobgoblin clad in loose armor, his eyes fixed lazily upon the approaching group. As the party neared the blockade, the hobgoblin stepped forward, back straightening as he brought a twisted war horn to his lips. The deep, brassy note blared across the narrow pass. Flanked by two other hobgoblins standing near the bound and kneeling forms of Orst and Bob, the hornblower lowered the instrument and called out with smug bravado, "Welcome to my pass. If you wish to proceed, you'll surrender your gold. If you'd rather go back—" He gestured behind them, where a small goblin strained to hold back a snarling ogre on a chain, the brute frothing and dragging his handler forward with every step. "Well, that'll cost all your gold as well." The hobgoblin grinned, fanged teeth bared, as if he were already counting their coin. Bob and Ost were tied securely behind the trio, ropes biting into their arms as they wriggled and strained against their bonds. Bob looked up at the rest of the party with a familiar expression of exasperated indignation. "Took you long enough," he muttered. Levi pinched the bridge of his nose. "Can't leave you two alone for 5 minutes, can we?" Before the banter could continue, Zal moved like a shot of lightning, impulsively spinning on his heel and charging back toward the goblin and the ogre behind them. The goblin, wide-eyed, simply let go of the chain in sheer terror. The ogre roared with glee, bounding forward, only to meet Zal's raised shield, head-on, in a crash that shook the ground and echoed between the cliffs. The three hobgoblins at the front turned in confusion. One looked to the other and asked uncertainly, "What do we do?" The third snarled, drawing his curved blade, "We kill them." With that, the trio charged forth, ignoring Bob and Ost completely. Jason's eyes narrowed. In a fluid motion, he drew his gleaming sword and dashed forward, intercepting the oncoming hobgoblins with righteous fury. Suddenly, from elevated passages on either side, goblin archers appeared, lining the cliffs with bows drawn. In uncanny unison, they loosed arrows high into the air, raining down upon the group. Yet most missed their targets, silently falling upon the rocks below. Jason met the charging hobgoblins with unshakable resolve, his blade a blur as he parried and countered with precision born of years of training. For a moment, it seemed he held the upper hand, holding off all three attackers through sheer tenacity and divine skill. But the numbers began to tell. One blade sliced across his shoulder, another forced him into retreat. He faltered a step, his defenses beginning to crumble beneath the coordinated assault. That's when Alaric joined the fray. With uncharacteristic seriousness, the bard drew his sword and rushed into the melee. "Can't let the new guy steal all the glory," he muttered, slashing low to intercept a hobgoblin mid-strike. The tide shifted again. 2 against 3 was still daunting, but now the enemy had to divide their focus, and that was all the opening the duo needed to press forward. Meanwhile, arrows zipped overhead, and chaos flared across the field. Levi crouched low behind a cluster of rocks, hands trembling as he looked around. He glanced to Zal, and the ogre still locked in brutal combat. to Bob and Ost struggling at their bonds, to the rising threat in every direction. Then he reached into his cloak and pulled forth the orb. "I don't know what this thing does," he muttered, "but let's see what it can really do." Levi raised a hand to cast Firebolt, arcane energy beginning to surge between his fingertips as he channeled the spell through the mysterious relic. The orb pulsed with growing intensity, until suddenly reality seemed to ripple beside him. A strange figure shimmered into view, a wizard with a tattered robe, crooked smile, and a singularly impressive unibrow. Before Levi could react, the stranger reached forward and snatched the orb from his hands with delicate precision. "Borrowing this," the wizard chirped cheerfully, winking with a grin far too wide for his face. Levi blinked. "Wait, what?" And then pop! The wizard vanished in a swirl of smoke and sparkles, cackling madly as he faded into thin air, leaving nothing but the echo of his laughter and the fading pulse of stolen magic. "Son of a—" Levi growled, firebolt still sparking uselessly in his palm. He then, turning his anger skyward, shouted out, "You never let me keep anything, do you?" "This has gone far enough," Ost stated, jumping to his feet, dropping the fake bonds. He then began to dash toward the elevated path to neutralize the archers. As he closed in, they abruptly looked his way in eerie unison, then vanished entirely. "Illusions!" Ost shouted in frustration. The ogre and Zal collided like living siege engines, each strike sending shockwaves through the rocky pass. Zal's sword met the beast's club with bone-jarring force, and each time the weapons clashed, dust erupted in thick clouds around them. Zal gave no ground, using every ounce of his towering strength to match the ogre's brutish might. Blow for blow, they battered one another, the ogre grunting with savage delight, Zal grim and silent as steel. Nearby, Jason was faring less well. Two hobgoblins had coordinated their assault, striking in near unison with calculated brutality. As one feinted high, the other slashed low, forcing Jason's blade upward to block both attacks simultaneously. Their combined weight drove him down to one knee, his weapon trembling against the pressure. He grit his teeth, eyes darting for options, but none presented themselves. If he broke the block, he'd be exposed. If he held it, he'd be crushed. Then came a blur of black. From behind one of the hobgoblins, Bob flashed into view, a dagger gleaming in his hand. He slashed deep across the enemy's throat in a fluid, practiced motion, and warm blood sprayed across Jason's face as the hobgoblin collapsed with a gurgling gasp. "Hey, new guy," Bob quipped mid-run as he darted toward Zal. Jason blinked, stunned, then grinned wickedly. With the weight gone, he surged back to his feet and launched into a flurry of attacks. The remaining hobgoblin barely had time to adjust before Jason overwhelmed him, blade flashing left, right, up, down, then driving straight into his gut. The enemy crumpled in place, eyes wide with disbelief. Alaric, meanwhile, danced steel with the third hobgoblin. They were evenly matched, parrying and slashing with no ground gained by either side. Alaric took a glancing cut across his arm and winced. "You swing that sword like you're holding a spoon," Alaric snarled, voice laced with magic. The insult hit harder than steel. The hobgoblin reeled back, clutching his ears as the bard's enchantment took hold, leaving him staggered and dazed. With a flourish, Alaric lunged and drove his sword into the hobgoblin's heart, ending the duel in one poetic stroke. At the far end of the pass, Zal and the ogre circled again, both wounded, both panting. The ogre snarled, foam flecking its tusks as it prepared for a final charge. Zal raised his shield, bracing, and then the ogre tripped. With a thunderous crash, the beast landed face first into the dirt. A black dagger jutted from the base of its skull, buried to the hilt. Its limbs spasmed, then went still. Bob, already climbing onto the ogre's massive back, tugged at the weapon with both hands. "It's harder to get out once it's in," he grunted, yanking in frustration. "Cause of the serration." He looked up at Zal, sweat dripping from his brow. "Mind giving me a hand here?" Zal said nothing at first, simply taking in the battlefield. Corpses lay strewn in every direction, hobgoblins, goblins, and the ogre alike. The dust had settled. Silence reigned. At last, Zal exhaled through his nose, sheathed his blade, and reached down to help. "Let's not do that again," Alaric muttered behind them. "I second that," Jason groaned, wiping blood from his brow. Bob finally freed his blade with a wet squelch and dropped to the ground. "Dinner and a show," he said with a grin, already moving to loot the nearest body. Evening shadows lengthened as the party approached the grey stone peaks, where nestled among the jagged stone was a temple, grand in design but clearly neglected, worn down by time and abandonment. Its weathered carvings bore the platinum sigil of Bahamut, still visible through lichen and soot. But what drew the group's attention immediately were the two orcs standing guard at the base of the worn marble steps. They were brutish, careless sentries, confident in their solitude and bored with the silence of a slaughtered sanctuary. Bob struck first. Silent as mist, the tall halfling melted into the gloom, creeping forward under the veil of fading light. One orc let out a confused grunt before Bob's dagger found his throat. No time for a cry, only the wet gurgle of final breath. The second didn't even turn before he met a similar fate, collapsing in a heap beside his companion. Inside the temple's main hall, two more orcs milled about in the desecrated chamber. The grand murals of Bahamut had been defaced, pews shattered and overturned. Piles of jewelry, holy symbols, and coin had been carelessly looted, and now stuffed into crude satchels tied to the waist of one of the orcs. Bob was a shadow again. The first orc died before he even noticed he was being hunted. One quick, brutal jab between the ribs, and he crumpled silently. But the second orc saw the assassination. With a furious roar, he locked eyes on Bob and charged, his axe raised and foaming rage in his mouth. Zal stepped from the shadows just ahead of the charging beast. The orc never made it 2 paces more. With an almost bored flick of his wrist, Zal's greatsword arced up and cleanly removed the orc's head from his shoulders. The body stumbled once, like it hadn't yet received the news of its death, then dropped, blood spraying across the dusty floor and over a shattered altar. Inside, the temple was a grim tableau. Dozens of worshippers lay dead, clergy, acolytes, and pilgrims alike, slain where they had prayed. Most of their bodies had been looted, rings ripped from fingers, amulets torn from necks, some even pried from the dead with savage cuts. The orcs hadn't been searching for anything in particular, just sating their hunger for violence and greed. At the far end of the hall, a single room stood sealed. Heavy furniture had been hastily stacked against the door from the hall, forming a makeshift barricade. The group approached cautiously, and gentle pulls boards and benches from the door. Bob rapped once with the hilt of his blade. "We're not your enemy," Zal called. "The orcs are dead. We honor Bahamut." A tense pause followed, then the sound of dragging furniture. The door creaked open. Framed in the doorway stood a tall figure, scales of silver and moonlight, catching the torch's glow. A dragonborn woman, clad in armor, etched with the sigils of the platinum dragon, regarded them with wary eyes and a warrior's poise. She held a heavy mace in one hand and clutched a holy symbol in the other. "My name is Zora," she said, voice calm and commanding. "Cleric of Bahamut." The group stared, momentarily struck by awe. They had never seen her kind before. Even Levi, still brushing blood from his robe, muttered, "Well, this is new." What exactly are you, and are you friend or foe?" Ost inquired with readied weapon. "My memory begins here," Zora explained solemnly, "discovered 2 decades ago by Mulland." Zora paused as she looked at the nearest body and bent down to gentle roll him over. A somber and thankful look spread across her face as his eyes began to water. "A high priest guided by divine visions to a hidden cave in these peaks. Inside, he found my brother Zaris and me, dragon humanoids unlike anything he'd known. We were raised in this temple, taught Bahamut's ways," she continued as she placed a gentle hand over his eyes and closed them. "What of your brother?" Ost questioned gently. Zora stood and quickly wiped her eyes, her expression hardening as her story came to an end. Zaris rejected this secluded life. At age 10, he left, vowing never to return. Mullen believed giants roaming these lands claimed him. I remained here, tending Bahamut's altar, keeping the faith alive in solitude. As she turned to gather her things, her eyes fell on Zal's shield, partially slung over his back. Her breath caught. She stepped forward with reverent urgency, reaching out with both hands to grasp the aged yet gleaming steel. Her fingers traced the embossed emblem etched into the metal. A radiant dragon's eye surrounded by 7 holy stars, the mark of the ancient Dragon Templar Order. "I've only seen this crest in books," Zora whispered. "Scriptures speak of it. A brotherhood of protectors, chosen by Bahamut in the age before recorded time. I thought them lost to myth." She looked up into Zal's eyes, her own wide with realization. "Bahamut has directed your path to me, here and now. Of that I am sure. It is with you my future lies." Zal, silent and resolute, gave a respectful nod. Whatever divine purpose stirred within her, it echoed in his soul too. He felt Rowan's presence again, faint but certain, like a breeze behind his back, pushing him toward something grander than himself. Not being ones to tempt the will of the divine or argue with fate, the group welcomed Zora into their fold without hesitation. As they prepared to leave the ransacked temple behind, they took time to catch her up on the trials they had already faced. The orbs, the strange rise of infernal forces, and the tangled web of quests left in their wake.